The conference room fell silent. 20 pairs of eyes swiveled toward me as my manager, Victoria, laughed a sharp, cutting sound that bounced off the glass walls like a blade. "This is adorable," Victoria said, not even bothering to hide a smirk. "Really, Harper, did you actually think this risk strategy would work?" I felt my face burn red. I had spent 3 weeks building this presentation, analyzing every possible angle, running simulations late into the night, while everyone else left at 5 o'clock. The CEO watched from the corner table, his expression unreadable. Other managers exchanged glances, some sympathetic, some enjoying the show. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the presentation remote, but I forced my voice to stay steady. "I can explain the methodology," I started, but Victoria cut me off with a wave. "No need. We'll stick with what actually works." She stood, gathered her papers, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned back with that same confident smirk. "Good effort though, Harper, really." The door clicked shut. I stood alone at the front of the room while conversations resumed around me, punctuated with awkward laughter. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody stayed to ask me questions. I had just been publicly dismantled by the one person whose job was to support me, and everyone in that room had watched it happen. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at nothing. I replayed the moment over and over. Adorable, the word cut deeper each time. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was something worse. I was thinking. My mind worked through the events systematically, like I was sorting puzzle pieces. Victoria had done this before. I could remember at least 5 other times when Victoria had stolen credit for my work, presented my ideas as her own, or cut me down in front of colleagues. But what stuck with me most was realizing that Victoria wasn't actually better than me. Victoria was just louder, more confident, and nobody questioned her because she acted like she belonged at the top. I had the evidence in my emails. I had the data. I had the documentation of every project where my work had been overlooked. I had watched Victoria make mistake after mistake, miss deadlines that nobody noticed, client feedback that got ignored, strategic errors that I had quietly fixed behind the scenes. I opened my laptop and created a new folder on my desktop. I titled it Evidence, then I started to work. The first thing I did was go through my emails methodically. I found the chain where I had originally proposed the risk strategy that Victoria had dismissed today. I found the emails where I had identified problems in Victoria's approach 6 months ago, problems that had never been fixed. I found the client feedback that praised my contributions while mentioning Victoria's oversight. I saved everything, every email, every document, every message thread. I created a spreadsheet listing every project Victoria had managed in the past year, noting which parts I had actually completed and which parts Victoria had either mismanaged or taken credit for. This wasn't about anger anymore. This was about facts. Over the next few weeks, I watched Victoria carefully. I noticed that Victoria relied entirely on my research before important meetings, but never mentioned me in front of executives. I noticed that Victoria made careless mistakes, missed details that a good manager would catch immediately. I noticed that Victoria spent most of her day in meetings and appearances, while actual work fell to the people beneath her. I also noticed something else. Victoria was getting lazier. The higher she climbed, the less careful she became. She assumed nobody was watching. She assumed nobody would dare to challenge her. That was her biggest mistake. I began attending meetings where I would normally stay quiet. I asked thoughtful questions. I offered insights. I showed colleagues that I understood the work deeply, not to be boastful, but simply by asking the kind of questions that only someone who truly understood the strategy would ask. I volunteered for difficult projects, the ones that seemed impossible. When Victoria assigned me an especially complex task 3 months in, expecting me to fail, I completed it in half the time with exceptional results. The client sent an email directly to my manager, not Victoria, but my actual boss above Victoria, praising my work specifically. That email stayed in my evidence folder. But I didn't stop there. I began studying office politics the way a general studies a battlefield. I identified who had real power, not Victoria, but the CEO and 3 senior executives who actually understood the business. I figured out which colleagues could be allies not through manipulation, but through genuine mentorship. When junior staff members seemed overwhelmed, I offered guidance. When they asked me questions, I answered thoroughly. Within months, people began seeking out my advice. People began trusting me. And critically, people began noticing that Victoria often presented ideas that sounded exactly like things I had said in small meetings days before. My composure became my greatest weapon. While Victoria grew increasingly flustered in meetings, speaking too loudly and over-explaining herself, I simply stated facts calmly and confidently. People responded to that. Even when colleagues made jokes about Victoria's management style jokes I heard through the office grapevine, I never laughed along. I simply kept quiet. That dignity made me more powerful, not less. Then came the moment everything shifted. A critical client emergency erupted, one that required immediate strategic intervention. Victoria was supposed to be in charge, but she was out of the office at a conference. The client called, and I answered. I solved the problem using the very risk strategy that Victoria had marked in that first meeting. The client was relieved, grateful, and impressed. When they sent the thank you email, they sent it to everyone in the management chain, making clear exactly who had saved their project. Victoria returned to find her inbox flooded with the story of her absence during a crisis, and my solution during her absence. Victoria's response was to become paranoid. She started monitoring my work more closely, questioning my decisions, and trying to reassert authority. But the more she did this, the more she revealed her insecurity. The more she tried to control me, the more her lack of confidence showed. Meanwhile, I documented every single insight and every micromanagement message, every unfounded accusation, every moment Victoria took credit for work that wasn't hers. My evidence folder grew thicker. What Victoria didn't realize was that I had also begun conversations with HR, not to complain, but to ask questions. What should I do about client feedback that reflects my contributions? How should I document my project work? What's the company process for noting who completed different parts of a project? I was careful, professional, and thorough. I was simply asking questions that made HR start thinking about the exact issues Victoria's management represented. Then came the confrontation. Victoria called me into her office and closed the door. I could see the fear mixed with anger in Victoria's expression. People are saying things about me, Victoria said, her voice tight. People are questioning my competence. I know you've been the source of this. I looked at my manager calmly. I haven't said anything to anyone about your management, I replied truthfully. I've simply been doing my job and documenting my contributions. Victoria's face darkened. You think you're clever, she said, her voice rising. You think this little strategy is going to work. But I've been in this company longer than you. I have relationships. Nobody's going to believe a junior staff member over me. I said nothing. I simply looked Victoria in the eye, and something in that silence made Victoria realize that this wasn't a confrontation I was afraid of. This was something I had been waiting for. The breaking point came 2 months later, during the quarterly executive review. The CEO had requested a comprehensive analysis of the company's risk strategies over the past year. Victoria confidently presented what she claimed was a thorough review of her team's performance. She highlighted successes, downplayed failures, and attributed key achievements to her leadership and vision. Then the CEO asked a simple question, Harper, your colleagues mention you've been deeply involved in risk mitigation. Can you walk us through your specific contributions? I opened my presentation calmly. I didn't attack Victoria. I didn't make accusations. I simply presented the timeline of every project from the past year, showing exactly which strategies I had developed, which client feedback I had received, which problems I had identified and solved, and which issues Victoria had either overlooked or mismanaged. I showed the original emails where I'd proposed the risk strategy Victoria had dismissed so publicly. I showed the client feedback that specifically mentioned my name. I showed the documents I had filed detailing my contributions. I spoke quietly and matter-of-factly, but every single word was supported by evidence. The room was absolutely silent. The CEO's expression shifted from neutral to thoughtful to clearly disappointed. Other executives began exchanging looks. One of them actually pulled out a notebook and started writing things down. Victoria's face went pale. She opened her mouth several times as if to speak, but said nothing. There was nothing she could say. I hadn't made any accusations. I had simply presented facts. The CEO thanked me and asked me to stay after the meeting. Victoria was asked to leave. In that private conversation, the CEO asked me about my future at the company. He mentioned that my strategic thinking was exactly what the company needed in a senior role. He asked if I had ever considered a management position. I said I would be interested in exploring that possibility. The CEO nodded and said they would be in touch. 3 days later, Victoria called an emergency team meeting. She announced that she was being reassigned to a different department, a lateral move, but one that everyone in the office understood meant a demotion. She would no longer be managing the risk strategy team. Instead, I would be taking on an expanded leadership role, with the team reporting directly to the CEO. Victoria tried to make it sound like a positive change, something she had decided to pursue for her own growth. Nobody believed her. Everyone in that room knew exactly what had happened. They had watched it unfold. My victory wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no confrontations, no tears, no harsh words exchanged. I hadn't violated any company policies. I hadn't broken any rules. I hadn't even really done anything except my job thoroughly, documented my work carefully, and remained calm under pressure. Victoria had destroyed herself through her own arrogance, her own inability to give credit, her own careless assumption that she could continue dismissing and belittling someone more talented than herself without consequences. In the weeks that followed, the culture of the team changed noticeably. People who had been afraid to speak up in meetings now felt comfortable sharing ideas. Junior staff members received actual mentorship and support. Mistakes were treated as learning opportunities rather than ammunition for public humiliation. My leadership style was the complete opposite of Victoria's, and people responded to it immediately. Productivity went up, client satisfaction improved. The team began delivering results that exceeded expectations. I never had to explicitly confront Victoria about what happened. I never had to explain my strategy or justify my actions. I simply had to do my work, document my contributions, and remain patient while circumstances played out. The truth, when presented clearly and supported by evidence, was far more powerful than any confrontation could have been. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the executive meeting, I received an email from the CEO's office. It was from a client I had been working with, sent through an internal colleague. The client wanted to hire me for a major external project consulting role, saying they would only work with me. The client's confidence in my abilities was absolute. This wasn't just a professional victory for me. This was external validation that I was genuinely talented, that people outside the company recognized my value, and that my success wasn't due to luck or office politics. It was due to real skill. I sat at my desk reading that email and realized something important. The humiliation I had felt in that conference room wasn't the end of my story, it was actually the beginning. That moment of public mockery had forced me to stop accepting mistreatment and start documenting the truth. That anger had transformed into something far more useful: strategy, patience, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. Victoria's dismissal had backfired spectacularly because it had awakened something in me, not a desire for revenge in the traditional sense, but a quiet determination to become undeniably excellent at what I did. I never needed to get even with Victoria. I just needed to be better, work harder, document everything, and remain patient while the truth slowly became impossible to ignore. And in the end, Victoria's own arrogance had been her downfall. She had assumed that confidence could substitute for actual competence. She had assumed that seniority meant nobody could challenge me. She had assumed that one dismissive laugh in a meeting room would keep someone like me in their place forever. She had been completely wrong about all of it. The best revenge, I learned, wasn't about destruction or humiliation. It was about quiet, relentless excellence. It was about building something undeniably good while my antagonist crumbles under the weight of their own mistakes. It was about being so obviously capable, so clearly trustworthy, and so visibly dedicated that everyone around me begins to wonder how I was ever overlooked in the first place. That was the kind of victory that lasted. That was the kind of success that couldn't be taken away or dismissed as luck. And as I accepted the consulting offer and continued building my career trajectory, I knew one important truth. The person Victoria had marked in that conference room had become far more valuable to the company than Victoria would ever be. And everyone, including Victoria herself, would have to live with that reality forever.